Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf Tet Vav 15 of Masechet Avodah Zarah. We are at the Mishnah on the bottom of Yud Dalet Amabet. And so that's a great place to get started. So we're going to share my screen and we will get started. Um, we have been discussing right now. We turned from the topic of when we can't do business with idolaters to certain things that you can't do a business with idolaters at all times. And now we're going to continue that list of items that we can't do business with idolaters regarding. So, makom shenagu limkor behema daka la'ovid kochavim, in places where they do sell smaller animals like sheep and goats as opposed to cattle. So then Mokran, we're allowed to sell those animals to them. And Rashi explains, first Rashi on the Mishnah, Makom shenago limkor bahema daka, could go Makom shelo nechshadu al haravia. It's a place where we have no concerns about bestiality. And that's how we're going to explain this discussion in the Gemara, that the point is we don't know for a fact that these people will engage in it. But the question is are they sufficiently possible that we develop the minhag not to sell to them? It's not that they generally don't, right, or generally do, because if they generally did, we wouldn't be allowed to sell it to them at all. So the point is, it's just the question of whether it's sufficient that such that they're the minhag created. Minhag shenago shelo limkor, and in a place where the custom is not to sell, well then ein mochron, you can't sell to them these smaller animals. But when it comes to larger animals, uv'chol makom ein mochron lehem behema gasa, but nowhere can you sell them large animals. Large animals are meant to work, and we are going to see. Let's take a look actually at the next Rashi, ubekol makom ein mokren lahem behema gasa, mipnei shemiyuchedet lemelacha. These animals are dedicated for working. What do you do with that? With the large oxen, you tie a yoke to them, and they pull the plow. And in the end, when you sell this animal to them, your animal that was not allowed to do work on Shabbos is going to end up doing work on Shabbos. Now, the Gemara is going to ask the question, I don't understand, right? If I sell my animal to a non-Jew, it belongs to the non-Jew. It doesn't belong to me. The obligations are done. So we're going to discuss that. That's going to be discussed in the Gemara. But the bottom line is that on some level, we don't want Jewish animals to work. Indeed, when we say Kiddush on Shabbos morning, we say that right? And all of your animals should not work, or should rest on Shabbos. So that's the principle that is driving us at this moment. And even though agalim usyachim, when it comes to calves or donkey foals, young donkeys, so that those two, even though obviously they're too young to do work at the moment, that you are still not allowed to sell those animals. Shleimim ushvurin. And similarly, whether they're healthy and complete, or shvurim, or whether they have some kind of breakage that makes them incapable of doing work. As Rashi tells us, agalim usyachim shleimim shvurim, va'afilu shvurim, even when they're broken, she'enan ru'uyan l'malacha, when they are not fit to do work, gazru bahu rabbanan, the rabbi still made a gezerah that you shouldn't sell them. Dilma asi la'achlufe, va'asi l'mezuban lahu gedol mushlemim, because maybe for whatever reason you'll end up needing to switch it out. Maybe your kid will have fallen in love with this particular one, and you don't want to get rid of it, and so as a result, you'll sell a complete animal, an adult animal, and that one animal would be fit for doing work. And now all of a sudden there's worry, as we are going to see that the fundamental concern about your animal working on Shabbos is not about the sale. It is true that if you sell an animal, then it will be fine for them for the non-Jew to work with it. The problem is that there are three other possibilities of what might happen. You could rent the animal, you could loan the animal, and you could help the buyer with a test of the animal. And all three of those things, if they happen on Shabbos, do involve your animal doing work, as we will see in the Gemara. As we are going to explain in the Gemara. So that is the first opinion of our Mishnah, the Tanna Kama, basically saying no sales of big animals. Small animals can be sold based upon the local custom. Rabbi Yehuda Mater B'Shvur. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, listen, if the animal is maimed, it's fine. And with Gemara, the Rashi tells us that Gemara will explain exactly what the details are here. And that will, I think, God willing, be tomorrow. So the point is that that's totally fine if it's a maimed animal. Uben Beseira Matir Besus. And Ben Beseira says, actually, you can sell a horse. And why can you sell a horse? Well, Rashi helps us out. She'ein melachto el rechiva. Because what do you use horses for? In general, apparently, at least in those days, the horses were used only for riding. You wouldn't put a load on a horse because a donkey is a much better animal for a load than a horse is. Horses are much better fit for human riders. Urechiva shvusi, and riding an animal is actually only a rabbinic prohibition. You might have thought that riding an animal might be biblically prohibited because, I don't know, it seems very workday kind of thing, but it's not. The reason that what we don't want is we don't want them to do work. The lav malacha. It's not malacha, and why is carrying a person not considered work? Mishum dechai noseas atzmo, because we have a general principle that a living creature carries itself. Meaning, even if you're carrying it, there is a big difference between carrying a sleeping toddler and carrying an awake toddler who wants to be carried. It is way easier to carry the awake toddler who wants to be carried than it is to carry the sleeping toddler. The sleeping toddler is just a load, but a awake toddler is fine. And indeed, this halacha applies that you are allowed, if you have a child who is capable of walking on his own, and you're outside the Erev, and all of a sudden the kid throws a tantrum and is feeling and you need to pick him up, you're allowed to walk with the child on Shabbos, even in a place without an Erev. Because
how about a stroller?
No, you can't take the stroller. The stroller, that's part of, you can't take a stroller. That's the point, is that you can only do this is only for somebody who's able to walk on their own. So you're allowed to carry them for the reason that Rashi is noting, that we say that a live animal, a live person carries itself. So as a result, the irony is that there it was two humans, but here we're applying it to a horse and a human, meaning the human that's riding the horse is effectively not considered a load because the human has the ability to walk, Baruch Hashem. So as a result, that's why. So therefore, lo ichbat lan iasi leheshilo l'schiro. So as a result, we're not going to be worried about lending the horse or renting the horse, because even if the horse belonged to you and now the non-Jew is using it, it wouldn't be a problem because your horse is not truly working on Shabbos, because all it's doing is carrying people who are able to carry themselves.
So you live in Montana.
Mm-hmm.
And the nearest shul is a mile away. You could get on your horse and...
Well, even though it's not a biblical prohibition, it is still a shvus, which is a rabbinic prohibition. Right. What's known as sheva al taseh, sit and don't do. Where the rabbis say there are some things that even though technically you would be allowed to do according to the Torah, we say don't do. And that's these is one of them. So it's a rabbinic prohibition. So as a result, it's interesting, right? So maybe in certain circumstances, if you have to do something, it's way better to do it as a rabbinic prohibition than it is to do a biblical prohibition. So, for example, starting a car is almost certainly, starting a non-electric vehicle, a traditional gas-powered vehicle, is almost certainly a biblical prohibition, starting a fire, etc. And so it would be way better if you have two options to get somewhere and you have to get somewhere in an emergency situation. It would be way better to ride a horse to get there than it would be to start your car. Okay. All right.
How about to swipe your Metro card and get on the train?
That's actually very interesting. Probably better to swipe your Metro card than to start a car. Absolutely. So also that would be true. Okay, so that was our Mishnah. Again, the additional things that you cannot sell to to an idol worshiper, and some of them actually really not only affect to idol worshippers, but anybody who's not Jewish. So the large animals that we say you can't sell is to anybody who's not Jewish, because we're worried that you'll end up coming to allow the animal to work on Shabbos, while it's in your ownership. So Lamemra de Isura. Now we go back to understanding the first prohibition that said that the first rule of our Mishnah, which said that when it came to smaller animals, in places where the custom is to permit, it's permitted. In the places where the custom is to prohibit, it's prohibited. So what does that mean? Lamemra de Isura Lega. Are you telling me that there's really no prohibition whatsoever? Min hagahu de ika, and only a custom? And heka de nehig isur nahug, heka de nehig heter nahug, and anywhere where it's the custom is to permit, it's okay, and the custom is to prohibit, that's okay? Or minu, 1 second. Ein ma'amidin behema befund kaos shel ovdei kochavim. We have a general rule that says you don't put animals, your animal, in a inn, namely a stable of that belongs to an idol worshiper, because we're worried that they'll engage with bestiality with your animal. So how that shows that this is actually a real halacha and not just a minhag, and it's actually should be prohibited. So how could it be that it's permitted? So Amarav makam she'etiru limkor hetiru liyached, makam she'asur liyached asur limkor. No, that rule that we said that's going to be in the Mishnah on Kaf Bet Amud Aleph, that rule according to Rav doesn't generally apply. It depends on the situation. In some places it applies, and in those places that's where the minhag is that you don't sell, and in other places it doesn't apply, and therefore that's a place where you're allowed to leave them alone, and you're allowed to sell to the small livestock to people who are idolaters. But Rabbi Elazar Omer, as we turn to Tedvav Amud Aleph, we say, no, even in a place where you're not allowed to, and really what he's saying is, generally, you're not allowed to leave your animal alone with an idolater. But mutter limkor. But even in those places, sometimes you can, in places where the custom is to permit selling it, you can sell it. My timer, why can you sell it? Because when it comes to the person's own animal, they don't want to engage in bestiality with their own animal, because they're worried that if they engage in bestiality with their own animal, well, then their animal will become sterile and not be able to have children, and that would reduce the value of their animal. So they, although they engage in bestiality, they are more concerned about the value of the animal that they would lose. Rashi goes through this in greater detail, but I'm going to, given the time that we spent on the Mishnah, I'm going to move on and note the following. So the Gemara continues. Third middle line of Tedvav Amud Aleph, middle of the line. Rav Hadarbe, and when Rav heard Rabbi Elazar's statement, he retracted his original statement. And as Rashi says, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines down in the narrow lines. Va'av Rav Hadarbe, because Rabbi Elazar, he changed his mind and thought like Rabbi Elazar. The Amar Rav Tachliva, Amar Rav Shela bar Avimi Mishmei de Rav, because Rav Tachliva said in the name that Rav Shela bar Avimi said in the name of Rav. So here we're getting Rav's own conclusion. He adopted the exact language that Rabbi Elazar used to explain why in our Mishnah there can be a custom to permit sales, whereas in the other Mishnah it says you're not allowed to leave your own animal with them. And it's because you can't leave your own animal because they won't be concerned about any damage that they cause to your animal, but they will be concerned about damage that they cause to their own animal, so therefore you can sell an animal to them in places where the custom is to permit. Okay, so that was the story about the small animals. Now we go to the large animals. We don't sell large animals. Well, my timer, what's the reason? It can't be that it's because of bestiality, because after all, as Rashi points out, next Rashi, so this is now 10 lines or 11 lines down in the Rashi, because he doesn't, not only is it a large animal and therefore he needs to be a little bit more careful about engaging in that kind of behavior, because the wrong kick can do real damage, but the point is that is that he doesn't want to damage the big investment that he made in the animal. So as a result, that's not why you can't sell it. So ma'aver ben by malacha chayshinan, but me'evid, I'm sorry, me'evid. So back into the Gemara. So what is it that we're worried about? So again, last word on the seventh line. The fact is that we're worried about the animal doing work, and we're going to see that we're talking about work on Shabbos. The Nevid. Well, 1 second. What's wrong with that? Let him do the work on Shabbos. After all, it belongs to him. Kevan dezavna knanya. Once it was sold to him, he's bought it. So I don't understand. So gzeira mishum she'elo mishum schiras. No, we're worried about your lending it to him or you're renting it to him, because you will still own the animal and it will be working on Shabbos. Well, sha'ala kanya va'agra kanya. Well, 1 second, isn't a borrowing transaction effectively transferring ownership, even if it's just for a portion of time? Because after all, that's what makes the borrower or renter responsible for the animal, for any damages that were to happen to the animal. So as a result, even if you rent it or lend it, it should also be as if it's owned by the borrower or renter, namely the non-Jew, and therefore it should be as if the non-Jew is working his own animal. So Ella Amar Rami Bar Brei de Rav Yeva. So Rami, the son of Rav Yeva, said, Gzeira mishum nisyoning. No, maybe you're right, and we'll see. We're going to discuss whether or not renting and borrowing transfers ownership. But the bottom line is that we also have something else to be worried about. We have to be worried about maybe the person is going to ask for a test. Namely, the person's going to sell the animal to the guy on a Friday afternoon, right before Shabbos. And what's going to happen? And the buyer's going to say to the seller, let's test to see whether the animal works. And this is going to go into Shabbos. And what are they going to do to test the animal? They're going to put a load on the animal. As Rashi says, Nisyone, this is from the bottom of the narrow lines of Rashi. It's about 15 or 16 lines up. Nisyone minasale I azla shapir kishehi teuna. We need to see whether or not this animal travels nicely when it's all loaded up. And so it'll be loaded up, and the person will now call the animal's name, and the animal with the load will go to the owner. And the owner will want it to do that walking. And this will constitute leading a loaded animal on Shabbos, and that is a prohibition of Shabbos. If you do it without realizing it, or realizing that it's Shabbos, or realizing that it's prohibited, you are going to be liable for a sin offering. So that's very serious. And so as a result, because of the seriousness of that sin, we are going to say don't sell, because we're worried that if in the process of the sale, you might on Shabbos end up calling the animal. So Maskif law Rav Shishi braid the Rav Idi. So now Rav Shisha tries to undermine the key element that we were just saying about whether or not borrowing and renting really affects an acquisition. Uschiras mikanya, do we say that renting actually is an acquisition? V'hatanan, af b'makom she'amru lahaskir. even in a place where you're allowed to rent to idolaters, lo leves dira amru. We're not, and this is, so back up, and what are we talking about? This Mishnah, which is going to be below on Daf Kaf Amud Bet and Kaf Aleph Amud Aleph, is talking about selling real property. So even in a place where we're allowed to rent property to an idolater, lo leves dira amru, you can't rent them a place for them to live. Why can't you rent a place to live in? Because they will bring their idols into that place. So this is clearly referring to idol worshippers as opposed to somebody who just worships, who's monotheistic but does not worship, does not, necessarily observe all the mitzvot. Now, if in fact we were to say that renting transfers ownership, well, then when he brings the idols into the house, he's bringing them into his own home. So why should that be prohibited? So shiny avodas gechavim dechamira. No, that's not a proof that renting doesn't convey ownership, because maybe this is a special rule for idolatry, that we don't want idolaters to bring property into your home, because you shouldn't bring an abomination into your house. And so even though it's no longer your house on some level, because you have some remnants related to the house, that's enough. We're going to say that it goes that far and is included. So as a result, that's not necessarily proof that renting doesn't convey ownership. So
But don't we have Gemara elsewhere?
What?
I think there are plenty of Gemara that once you rent the property to someone, that the renter has reshut. You can't just go in the middle of the night and not walk in his door. He has the keys to it. You've given it over to him. He has. I encountered this personally. I asked the Rav that your rental place is yours. The owner who owns the building, can't just walk into your building. He can't examine your idols the person's idols. That's his reshut, right?
Well, you're absolutely right that it is his reshus, but the point is that the underlying ownership still belongs to the owner, and as a result, when there's something that's limiting your ability to do something in the property, we're going to see that in fact, that's the question that we're asking right now. Well, we're addressing this precise question. And so our assumption is that the ownership that you convey to the renter is complete. That's the assumption, and we're trying to challenge that assumption. We are going to be successful in that challenge in just another moment, but you're absolutely right that right now, at the moment, we have effectively said that that renting transfers ownership completely, and therefore you would have, as the landlord, you would have zero rights to go into the property.
Right.
Okay, but you're absolutely right. So Maskiv la Rav Yitzchak braid the Rav Mesharshia, but Rav Yitzchak, the son of Rav Mesharshia, said the following and offered the following objection. Uschiras mikanya, 1 second. When it comes to an animal, does renting really create an acquisition? V'hatanan Yisrael shesachar para mikohen. If a Jew rents a cow from a Kohen, so now the Jew is the renter. Yachilenu karshine truma. You are allowed to feed it the feed, animal feed that is from truma. Now, you as a non-Kohen would not be allowed to feed this to your own animal, and yet you can feed it to the animal that you rent from the Kohen because it belongs to the Kohen. And on the other side, the Kohen shesachar para miYisrael, when a Kohen rents a cow from a non-Kohen, even though the Kohen took on the obligation to feed the animal, lo yachilena karshine truma. He's not allowed to feed it truma feed. But if you were to say that renting creates an ownership, amai lo yachilenu, why would he not be allowed to feed it? Parabdidehi, it belongs to him. Ela shma mina schiras lo kanya. So the bottom line is is that we show that schirus does not actually affect an acquisition. And indeed, the Gemara does not have an answer to this question. And so as a result, on some level, notwithstanding the fact that a landlord does not have unlimited rights to go into the property, the landlord does still serve as the owner of that property. And so as a result, potentially, to give the case that Kenneth was talking about, if in fact somebody were to, if you were to have a renter who seems to be engaging in idolatry in that rental property, you would need to go in and use your rights as a landlord to try and stop and take the idolatry out of the property because it belongs to you. Vahasha de Amrat Schiris Lokanya. So now that we've said, and we seem to conclude here, that that leasing does not create an acquisition, at least with respect to movable property, we'll leave to the side real estate. Gzeirim mishum schirus. So ugzeirim mishum she'ela, ugzeirim mishum nisyonek. Now we can understand that the reason that we're not allowed to sell to a non-Jew a large animal is because we're worried that you might rent the animal to the non-Jew, you might lend the animal to the non-Jew, and even if you just engage in a sale, during the sale process, you might test the animal for the non-Jew prior to affecting the transaction, and on Shabbos, you'll end up having engaged in mechamer. So that is the bottom line. And so as a result, that is why we are going to not allow you to engage in this behavior. Okay.
It seems like there's a fault in the very premise of this whole discussion. There is a distinction, at face value, between selling and renting. And the Mishnah talks about sale. We can imagine scenarios where, okay, maybe he'll return it, you drive the car out, you don't like it, you bring it back, but a sale is still a sale. And the Mishnah clearly talks about sale. For the Gemara now to talk about, well, maybe he's lending, not lending.
No. You have to, sorry, let me clarify. Thank you for that question. The Gemara is saying that the reason that we can't sell the animal is because if we allow you to sell the animal, you might think that you could rent the animal or that you could lend the animal. And we don't want you to think that. So as a result, we're not even going to allow you to sell the animal because it would be problematic for you to rent and to rent or to lend or to test the animal. And because of all of those concerns, we make a gezerah, right? The point is that the gezerah is because of the possibility of renting. It's because of the possibility of borrowing. It's because of the possibility of testing. And so because of all of those possibilities, what is it that we're prohibiting? We're prohibiting the sale. And that's what the Mishnah is telling us.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I still think that I hear that argument, and there's logic to it, but there is still a distinction between sale and lending, and that's
100%, absolutely. But notwithstanding that distinction, the rabbis chose to create a gzera that says don't sell because we're worried that you might think that you could also lend or lease.
All right.
Okay. So next, the Gemara now records some related rulings. So Rav Ada Shara Lezabune Chamara Aida Desafsira. So Rav Ada permitted the sale of a donkey to an idolater, presumably, through a broker. So imishum nisyone. Now, 1 second. And so what about all the gezeras that we just said?
Yeah.
Well, imishum nisyone, when it comes to testing, halo yada lekale. Well, the broker isn't the one, the animal that that has supervised the animal for all these years and is going to be able to call the animal and get it to do anything. So as a result, there's no special connection that the broker has with the animal that will result in the broker calling the animal as part of a test. To Uzle Machmate, that would cause it to walk as a result of it. And so therefore, the broker can say, listen, you go ahead and call. I don't know this animal any better than you do. And if you talk about borrowing or leasing the animal or renting the animal, because the broker doesn't own it, Lo Moshe v'lo Moger. He's not going to lend it out. He's not going to lease it out. He's not going to rent it out. Also, his compensation is based on his selling it. And if he lends it out or rents it out, it's more likely that it will be found to have some kind of blemish. And he wants to diminish the likelihood of that. As Rashi says, fourth line from the bottom of Rashi on Tezvav and Aleph, Kevan dehu because this broker took it in order to sell it. He doesn't want anybody to know that there are defects Shaba in this animal. He has no incentive to rent or to lend it. Okay, so that's case number one. Case number two. Rav Huna zabin lahahi para laovikochavim. Rava sold an animal directly, a cow, which is a large animal, to an idol worshiper. So Amarle Rav Chisda said to him, "My time oven marhachi. How can you do that?" So Amarle Amar lashkita zavna. I sold it to him because he wanted it to slaughter, and so as a result, or I can at least say that he wanted it to slaughter. This is going to be a big issue. Okay, so let's remember this case because we're going to have another case. And in the end, we're going to see that Rav Huna does not get rejected. Rav Huna's position that you could sell the animal to an idol worshiper because you could say that it was supposed to be for slaughter does not get rejected. And yet we're going to see at the end of today, in just a few moments, Rabbah is going to sell a donkey to another Jew who was suspected of selling animals to idolaters. And there, obviously, we don't have to worry about, where it's unlikely to have been sold for food. And Rabbah is going to have thought, well, maybe the guy who will sell it to a Jew, and he's going to, in the end, say that we don't allow it. So let's focus here on these two cases because we're going to need to explain, and we're going to cite the Ritva and the Rashba to explain how we can coincide these two cases. So let's take a look. So again, Rav Huna explains that he allowed this sale of his animal to an idolater because maybe it was being purchased to slaughter. So the Gemara asks as we turn to Tezvav and Bet, Umina Tamra da Amrina ki hai gavda. How can you say that? How can you make that assumption? All right, so I'll tell you how. Ditnan Beishamai Omrim Lo Yimkor Adam Para Hakol Reshus B'Shvius. You can't sell a plowing animal during the 7th year. So Beis Shammai says you can't do it because we're worried that if you sell a plowing animal, that animal is going to be used to plow, and you're a good person, but the person who buys it from you may not be a good person, and he may use it to plow during the 7th year. But Beis Hillel says you're allowed to sell it because maybe the person who's buying it wants to slaughter it. So just as in this, and of course we hold like Beis Hillel. So just as Beis Hillel says maybe the person is going to buy an animal during the 7th year, even though it's a large animal that's often used for work, he's not going to work the animal, rather he's going to slaughter the animal. So too, when an idolater buys a large animal that's capable of being slaughtered for food, so too we'll say that he's going to slaughter it for food. So
is Hillel and Shammai, are they arguing about sale to a Jew or to a non-Jew?
They're arguing about sale to a Jew. They're arguing about sale to a Jew, but because obviously a non-Jew would be allowed to use it on Shvius. There's no Shvius to a non-Jew. But Amar Rava, and this is the Masoras Hashas changes this to Rava here. Mi dame. 1 second. These cases aren't comparable. Hasam ein adam mitzuba al shvisas behemto b'shvius. There is no prohibition of having your animal work during the Shemitah year. It's only the prohibition of working during Shvius is on you on the land. And so, yes, you can't have your animal work on the land, but that's a prohibition on you and the land, not on the animal. But haka adam mitzuva al shvisas behemto Shabbos. But here, the prohibition is on the person doing it on Shabbos, and it's on the person not allowing their animal to do it. And so, as a result, this proof is not a good proof. So now Abaye and Rav Ashi question all aspects of Rava's proof. So Amarle Abaye says to Rava, 1 second. Are you, the implication of your question is that if in fact it's if a person is commanded not to do something, well, then they would be prohibited to sell that thing to somebody else because we're worried that they might do something. But is that really true? V'harei sadeh, when it comes to a field during the Shemitah year, da'adam mitzuva al shvisas sadehu b'shvius. You're not allowed to work your field during the Shemitah year. And yet, Vitanya, again, this is also changing, the Masoras Hashas changes this to Vitanya because it's actually a brisa. Beis Shammai omrim, lo yimkor adam sadeh nir b'shvius. You cannot sell a plowed field during the 7th year, because a person is able to let the field lie fallow. And so as a result, maybe that's what he's going to do. And since we have that possibility, even though the field itself has the prohibition, and the prohibition's on you not letting the field work. And so as a result, we see that that it's not true that when the prohibition is on the person himself, that he's commanded to have something rest, that we're going to say that he's not allowed to sell it, because Beis Hillel says you can sell the field. And Maskef lo Rav Ashi asks from the other perspective, and by the way, you imply that when it's not on the person, meaning when the command is not on the person to avoid working something, that you therefore would be allowed to sell it. V'harei kelim. What about vessels, farming tools? De'ein adam mitzuva al shvius kelim b'shvius. You're not prohibited to. You're not commanded to let your kalim, your vessels, your tools, your farm tools rest during the Shemitah year. And yet, utnan, we have in a Mishnah, there's a Mishnah in Shvius, Perek Hey, Mishnah Vav, Ilu hein kalim she'ein adam rashai l'mokram b'shvius. Here are the vessels that you're not allowed to sell during the Shemitah year. Hamacharesha, a plow, v'chol keleha, and all its accessories. Ha'ol, the yoke, v'hamizra, a sha'ol, hadeker, and a hoe. So you're not allowed to sell these, even though you have no requirement to ensure that they rest. Meaning that if you wanted to, you could lend them to a non-Jew who's working on his own field and have that non-Jew borrow these. There's no prohibition associated with that. And yet we say you can't sell them. And so that shows that Rava's response to Rav Huna's proof is not actually a good proof. And so as a result, the bottom line is that we're going to, it's totally okay. Ella amar Rav Ashi kol hecha deika lemisla talinan. The bottom line is when there's, as Rav Ashi explains, whenever we have the ability to make an assumption to be lenient, So then we can be assume that and be lenient. But aval gafta mitzuva, and it doesn't make a difference whether the person is commanded. And when you don't have the possibility of making an assumption for a leniency, lo talina, then we're not going to make the assumption. Aval gavda eino mitzuva, even though the person's not commanded. So we have now just said that if we can make an assumption, we're going to allow the assumption. We're about to do a case where we're not going to allow that assumption. So let's take a look as we finish today's daf. So Rabba Zabinahu.
Are we saying, ultimately, can a person sell his tools? He can lend them. He can't sell them. Is that what we're saying?
During Shemitah year? Yes, that's correct. He can't sell them to a Jew during Shemitah.
Not a Jew, but a non-Jew. Can he sell them?
No. So to a non-Jew, I think you would be allowed to sell it. It's just because we're worried. The concern is that we're worried about effectively being lifnei iver lo titain michshol, that we're violating the commandment of putting a stumbling block in front of somebody, because we're effectively facilitating a Jewish buyer's engagement in work on during the Shemitah year. And so as a result, you can't sell it to a Jew. You would be able to sell to a non-Jew.
And would there, if he sells it to a non-Jew, would there be a prohibition on the kesef that he got from that?
No, I don't think so. But and even if he sold it to a Jew, it's not clear that there would be a prohibition on the kesef that's associated with it. But okay, Rabba Zabin Lahahu, I mean, he would have violated a mitzvah. He would violate it either, but I don't think that it would necessarily cause a prohibition. It's unlike when we're dealing with idolatry. If you sell something for idolatry, then the money is going to be prohibited. That's going to be a later perek in Avodah Zarah, I believe. Right. So Rabba Zabin Hahu Chamara. So Rabba sold a particular donkey. Yisrael Hachashad Limkar La'ovid Kokovim, to a Jew who's suspected of selling large animals to idol worshippers. So Amrle Abaye, my time of in Marhachi, why did you do this? So Amrle, Anali Yisrael Zabini, I sold it to a Jew. I'm allowed to sell it to a Jew. So Amrle, but he sells these animals to non-Jews. And so Yisrael lo kamazab. So I'm sorry. So now so he's going to sell, so he can sell it. He sells it to non-Jews. So Rabbah responds back, lo v'kochavim kamazabin Yisrael lo kamazabin. 1 second, are you telling me that he's only going to sell it to a non-Jew or to an idol worshiper? Maybe he'll sell it to a Jew, right? He's not going to sell it to a Jew. Of course, he's willing to sell it to a Jew.
Why is that your problem? Once you've sold it to him, you're done. Why is it your problem what he does with it?
Well, because we're going to see. Let's take a look. In fact, that's exactly you're exactly right. That's effectively what Rabbah is saying, right? Well, I'm done with it. So Yisrael lo mezabin bidmia hilkok talin and Yisrael. I can rely on the fact that maybe he'll sell it to a Jew. So, and by the way, if I knew that he was going to sell it to a non-Jew, then I would have violated lifnei iver, because the buyer who's Jewish did not have this animal beforehand, and now he has the animal that he can sell to a non-Jew, and so now he's going to sell it to a non-Jew, and so I have facilitated his violation of this prohibition.
But you can't check every buyer. If you sell it to somebody, he sells it to someone, sells it. There's ain't of ourself.
The assumption is, right? The assumption is that Rabbah knew that the Jew was suspected of selling animals to idolaters. If he didn't know that, you're absolutely right. It would have been totally fine. But he knew that this was a person who sold the animals to idolaters. So Esvei, so in second, responding to Rabbah, Makom Shenogo Limkor Behema Daka Luxusim. Listen. When in a place where the custom is that you're allowed to sell small livestock to kutim mochrin, shalolim kor ein mochrin. So similar to our Mishnah, where we had that you can sell to Avodah Zarah, to Ovdei Avodah Zarah in general, small animals. Same the issue with respect to kutim. Now, my timer, what's the reason that we might have had a custom not to sell to kutim? If you want to say that it's because we're worried about them engaging in bestiality, is that really something that they're suspected of doing? But Tanya, we have another brisa that makes clear that we do not suspect kutim to engage in bestiality. Because what do we say? First, we're going to talk about non-kutim. When it comes to stabling your animal at an inn, we don't do that if it's an inn that belongs to idol worshippers. Even if it's male animals with men, and women and female animals with women. And because bottom line is that when it comes to the male animals, we're worried about them engaging, as Rashi describes it, in sodomy. And when it comes to the women animals, with the women, we're worried not about the women engaging in anything with the women animals, but we're worried about the fact that women Ovdei Kochavim are frequently engaging in illicit relationships with other men. And so as a result, the men are going to come and visit them, and they're going to not see them at home, and they'll end up seeing the animal there and engage in bestiality. So as a result, that's we therefore don't even allow women to take care of women animals, women Avodah Zarah with female animals. Of course, you can't do nekevos eitzel zacharim u'zacharim eitzel nekevos. Can't do female animals with men and male animals with women. And not only that, but we similarly won't give our animals to a shepherd that is in Ovdei Avodah Zarah. And we need to be careful not that we ourselves not be secluded within Ovdei Avodah Zarah, because shechashad al shvichas damim, Rashi tells us that we're worried that there'll be a murderer. And we won't give them a child to lilamdo sefer, either to teach them as a school child, ulamdo umanos, or to teach them a profession. So the point is that all of that is prohibited with respect to a Ovdei Avodah Zarah. And yet, aval, but when it comes to kutim, you can do that. Whether even when you have male animals with females and female animals with males. And certainly you can do male animals with males and female animals with females, because although the kutim were very upset with them that they aren't full-fledged converts to the Judaism, and that they really didn't necessarily do all the right things, but the bottom line is that they're not animals. They're not they don't make up whatever they want and do whatever they want the way idolaters, because fundamentally, again, idolatry is about doing what you want and justifying it with your religion. And we can even use kutim shepherds as people to watch our animals. And we can be alone with them without worrying about them murdering us. And we can have them watch a kid, Lulamdo Sefer, to teach them in school, Ulamdo Umanos, or to teach a profession. So Alma Lo Chashidi. So we see that they're not suspected of bestiality. So why is it that we're not allowed to sell a small animal in places that there's a custom to not sell small animals to kutim? It must be because we're worried that the kuti is going to go ahead and sell that animal to an idolater, and that's going to be a problem. And so as a result, that shows that that Rabbah's justification is not valid. It's not okay to just say, well, maybe the kuti will sell it to a Jew or another kuti. We're worried about the kuti selling it to an Ovdei Avodah Zarah. So v'od Tanya, and we have another brisa that emphasizes that we remain concerned about selling, about on-selling by our customers. Ein mochen lahem lo zayin v'lo klei zayin. We're not allowed to sell to idol worshippers. Rashi tells us this is referring to idol worshippers. We're not allowed to sell to them weapons or accessories to those weapons. And we can't sharpen their weapons. And we can't sell them, the shackles and prison collars. Velo kavalim, velo shalshalos shel barzel, and we can't sell them different kinds of chains to shackle people. Echad ovid kochavim be'echad kuti, and it doesn't make a difference whether you're selling it to an idol worshiper or a kuti, meaning, so my timer. So why can't you sell it to the kuti? Rashi explains that my time akuti kai, that this is going on the reference to the kuti. Why can't you sell it to the kuti? You can't say that it's because we're worried about them doing murder, because umichashidi, are we actually worried? V'ha'amrat, we said in the brisa that we quoted earlier, you're allowed to be alone with the kutim. So we're not worried about them engaging in murder. Rather, we're worried that the kuti is going to on-sell the weapon that you sell to him to an idolater. And as a result, that's going to be the problem. So we see in both of these cases, when it comes to the kuti, that we're worried about on-sale. Maybe you'll want to make the following argument that, okay, the reason that we are worried about a kuti engaging in an on-sale to an Ovid Kochavim is because he'll think that there's nothing wrong with it, and therefore he has no basis to do tshuva, and as a result, he's going to for sure sell it on to an idol worshiper. But a Jew knows that it's wrong, and maybe he'll do tshuva. But that's not enough, because V'ha'amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Baravua Kideruk she'amru asar limkor la'ovid kochavim, kach asar limkor liYisrael achashad limkor la'ovid kochavim. That just as we can't sell any of these weapons to an idol worshiper, we're also not allowed to sell them to anybody, to a Jew who's suspected of selling these items to an idol worshiper. So the bottom line is, Rabbah, how could you possibly have done this? And so as a result, it's remarkable, but Rahit Basre Tlusa Parse. Rabbah ran after the buyer for 3 parsas. The Ika de Amre Parsa B'chala, and some say it was a parsa in sand where it's harder to run. Below Adrache, and he never was able to catch up to him. But really, we're not allowed to engage in this. So the Gemara concludes that we may not sell to a Jew who's suspected of selling to an idolater based on the assumption that maybe he will sell the item to a Jew. So now the question is, how come when it came to selling directly to the idolater, we could say that maybe he's going to use it for shchita, and how come here we don't say that maybe he's going to sell it to a Jew? What's the difference between the two cases? So the Ritva explains that Rav Huna's case involved a non-Jew known to buy animals for both for work and for slaughter. And so as a result, there was a basis to specifically say. So as a result, Rav Huna could rely on the presumption there. But when there's no special reason to assume that the buyer won't do the wrong thing, we need to be worried in cases like Rabbah's. And the Rashba adds that the buyer in Rav Huna's case also gets enjoyment from eating the animal. Whereas here, there's no difference in the enjoyment that the seller gets from selling to a Jew or to an idolater. And so as a result, there's no basis to say, oh, well, maybe he wants that specific kind of enjoyment. And so that's an additional factor that the Rashba adds in this context, and so as a result, that explains the difference. So let's do one last piece. Having just mentioned the limitation on selling weapons, the Gemara records a related ruling. Amar Rav Dimi, Kederach she'asar limkor la'avod lo'ovid kochavim, asar limkor l'listim Yisrael. Just as you can't sell to idolaters, you cannot sell weapons to Jewish robbers. Well, 1 second. Heiki dami. If we're worried, talking about a Jewish robber who we're worried may kill somebody, pshita, obviously you're not allowed to do that. Hainu ovid kochav. It's the same thing as with an idol worshiper, meaning you're in the end, what you're doing is you are being over on lifnei iver. You're putting a stumbling block in front of them. You're facilitating their violation. The idolo katil. And if in fact the person is not suspected of killing anybody, well, then Amilo, why can't you sell it to him? He's a good Jew. He's not going to kill anybody with this weapon. La'olam de lo katal. No, really, we're talking about a situation where the person's not suspected of killing. And here's the case that we're talking about. B'mashmuta, where a person is just taking things away sneakily. Because what's going to happen? Somebody's going to see him, run after him, and try to get back the item. Well, what's going to happen in that moment? At that moment, he's going to defend himself. And so as a result, he's going to act to defend himself, and he's going to kill somebody, and therefore we're worried about it. As Rashi says, last Rashi on the daf, Olam de lo kato b'mashmota de avid la'tzulei nafshe, listim hashomin, robbers that remove mammon miyad balav, that remove the money from the hands of the owners, the nimlat, and then they run away, the holech, and they go somewhere else. The kisherod and achrab, and when people chase after them, nilcham, they'll do battle. Umatzil atzmo, and he'll try to save himself. Umevavid zeh es mamono, and he'll cause this person to have lost the money. And so as a result, the bottom line is that if you sell the weapons to this thief, you are causing the others to lose their money, and therefore it is going to be prohibited. So we just discussed weapons, but what about a shield? Is that for protection and permitted, or is it for war and forbidden? Well, for that discussion, stay tuned for tomorrow's daf.
Who's losing the money here with the robber?
The victim of the robber is losing the money. And so the point is that your selling, one's selling of weapons to such a robber is effectively causing the loss of money to the victim of the robber.
But one sold it to the robber, right?
Correct. One sold the weapon to the robber. But
so the robber is now committing a crime against somebody else.
Exactly.
Right. Oh, okay. Now, what was the Ritva and the Rashba? What was their?
So the point is that in our second case, right, in the three cases that we talked about, Rav Huna's case, we say you can sell the cow to an idol worshiper, and we allow it because that idol worshiper may have purchased it for slaughter. So when do we say that? And when do we say? And yet with Rabbah, who sold a donkey to a Jew who is suspected of selling to idolaters, we don't say, oh, well, maybe he's going to sell it to a Jew. So why in one case do we say maybe he bought it to slaughter? And in the other case, we don't say maybe he bought it to sell it to another Jew. And the answer is
to a Jew or to an idolater?
Oh, I'm sorry, to $1. Maybe he bought it to no. The point is that if we say that he bought it to sell it to a Jew, well, then it would be okay. Now, Rabbah justified selling the donkey to a Jew who sold donkeys to idolaters by saying, well, maybe this Jew won't sell this donkey to an idolater. Maybe he'll sell it to another Jew.
Right.
And so why in one case do we make an assumption that allows for the transaction? And in the other case, we don't make the assumption that allows for the transaction. And Rabbo therefore ran after the person who bought the donkey from him, even if he wasn't able to catch him. And so the point is that the two aspects are, one is we slightly change or qualify the case of Rav Huna, and we say that Rav Huna sold the animal to somebody who definitely buys animals both for slaughter and for working. And therefore, because the animals that he buys, some of them are definitely used for slaughter, we are going to say that we can rely on it being used for slaughter. Now, in second, you might say, well, why don't we say the same thing with respect to Rabbah, saying, well, maybe the person is a person who sells both to idolaters and to Jews, and so let's rely on the fact that he sold it to Jews. So that, therefore, in addition to the Ritva's clarification of saying that Rav Huna is selling to somebody who does both, we add the Rashba, and the Rashba points out that in the case of shchita versus working, there are unique benefits to shchita, meaning you get to eat the delicious animal. And so as a result, therefore, we can imagine a case where one would prefer slaughtering it to eating it. And therefore, when the person does both,
slaughtering to working it. You mean?
Thank you. Slaughtering it to working it. Thank you. So as a result, therefore, we can say Rav Huna is able to say, okay, we're going to rely on the fact that he's going to use it to slaughter it. But when it comes to the selling it to the Jew, who maybe sells to Jews and to non-Jews, there is no difference between the two. And so as a result, when there's no special benefit that the Jewish buyer who's suspected of selling to idolaters gets from selling it to a Jew, well, now we have to view them as equal possibilities, and therefore we're going to say we have to be worried that he's going to sell it to a non-Jew. And so that's the distinction between the second case and the third case that we had of the three cases, three examples. So that's why Rabbah's sale of a donkey to a Jew suspected of selling to idolaters is actually not permitted, and we would prohibit it. Whereas Rav Huna's sale of a particular cow to an idol worshiper is going to be something that we're going to allow, and so you can follow that path and do the exact same thing.
There one point that is a little bothersome. Generally, we say we're not chashinin b'kasherim. So you have
Correct.
to know with some certainty that this Jew is going to sell
100%.
really based on his history that he would sell it to a
Correct.
to a chaver.
Correct. Absolutely. That we are assuming in this case that we definitely understand that this is somebody who has sold and would sell to idolaters. And so you're absolutely right. That's exactly correct. That there has to be some basis for thinking that he's going to sell. You can't just go based on nothing. And so you're absolutely right. That's exactly correct. So because we don't just we're not going to just say, well, every stomp person we have to be worried about selling it to anybody. Then you wouldn't be able to sell your animal to anyone. So it's specifically, you're absolutely right. Specifically somebody who's suspected of selling to a non-Jew.
All right.
Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Look forward to continuing our learning tomorrow. Tomorrow, 7:30. We'll get started. Looking forward to learning together tomorrow at 7:30 so that we can be ready for 8:30 davening.